Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ambassadors and members of the diplomatic missions, colleagues, students, friends, welcome to you all. It is my distinct pleasure to chair this session tonight, introducing a very good friend that I think we met for the first time about 25 or 27 years ago, when Martin was the director and actually who established the Middle East, or the Near East actually, center in Washington. Ambassador Indyk really doesn't need any introduction to the Israeli public. I think he is not only known in Israel as a very good friend, who is intimately familiar with the Israeli scene and with the Middle Eastern scene, with the personalities, and his personal experience and encounters with Israeli prime ministers in Israel is virtually unparalleled, and this is very well reflected in his most recent book, Innocent Abroad. He is not innocent anymore, I can assure you. He shares in this book his experiences in working with the Israeli leadership as well as the leadership of neighboring countries and of the Palestinian leadership. It is really a tour de force, which I would recommend every young diplomat, friend and adversary alike, to read before he or she are getting involved with the intricacies of Middle Eastern policies. I can actually recommend it not only for young diplomats, but also for those who are more experienced. There is much to learn about it. Martin is a critical friend. Critical in the way because he intends and has the best intention and the best sentiments for Israel, but also critical sometimes both in his position as the ambassador, which he served twice in Israel as a US ambassador to Israel, and also during his experience working with the National Security Council and in the State Department during President Clinton administration. He is really a very sophisticated analyst, and in the introduction to his book, which I recommend to you all to read, Ambassador Indyk reflects on the initiatives that President Clinton and his team believed that they were involved in a noble effort to reform the Middle East and America's image. And they were parallel to that also involved in a parallel effort of dual containment, understanding there's an absolutely essential need to limit as much as possible the negative role of Iran and Iraq against the policy of pursuing peace and stability initiated by the Clinton administration. The third part of his book addresses the deterioration of peace efforts following Prime Minister Rabin's assassination. This is a sad story that is still affecting the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians today in an effort which I'm not sure will be very successful to salvage it from its present frozen status. Martin Indyk is today the Vice President of the Brookings Institution and Director of its Foreign Policy Program. He was the founding director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in the mid-80s and of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. Ambassador Indyk is actually familiar quite with these grounds because during the Yom Kippur War, he spent a sabbatical, actually as a visiting scholar at the Hebrew University. We are all looking forward to hearing your comments, Martin, on your strategy for a region in turmoil, and I would like you to join me in welcoming Ambassador Indyk tonight.
Thank you very much, Puyo. Puyo and I had the opportunity to get to know each other in Washington when, as you may know, he served with great distinction as Israel's ambassador to the United States in the 1980s. And we've been friends ever since. I've long admired the way in which you conducted yourself in difficult circumstances, and you represent the finest of Israel's diplomats. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear. Yeah. I'm sorry my mother wasn't here to hear your introduction. But it's great to be back at the Hebrew University. My grandfather, when he was a young man, came from Poland to participate in the laying of the foundation stone of the Hebrew University on this campus. And as Puyo mentioned, I was supposed to be a graduate student here, and was studying at the Ulpan HaKayetz at the Ramat Gan campus in 1973. Unfortunately, the Yom Kippur War broke out, and the university closed down, and so I never got the opportunity. So for that reason, in particular, it's a sentimental journey back here to this Hebrew University campus today. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm also impressed that 3 centers or departments, institutes could come together to put on this conference. I'm not sure that we could do it amongst the centers and institutes within the Brookings institution, so I would congratulate you on that. And of course, I'd like to congratulate the students on their awarding of the BS scholarships. I've been asked to speak today about US policy towards the Arab awakenings. And I think it's important to start with an understanding that the United States policy towards this volatile but vital region has actually been amazingly stable over the 5 decades since World War II, regardless of whether you had a Democratic or Republican president in office. That's because there was basic consensus across the political spectrum in the United States on the 4 basic interests that since the Second World War, the United States has identified as the ones that needed to be protected and promoted in this region. The 4 are Israel, oil, oil, and oil. The commitment to the survival and well-being of the Jewish state was something that grew over time since the United States was the first country to recognize Israel at its birth. But that commitment has grown to a core bipartisan commitment, reinforced by the overwhelming support of Congress and very strong support amongst American public opinion that has been abiding over the decades and is based at heart not so much on common interests as it is on shared democratic values. I emphasize democratic because what we're going to be talking about this evening is fundamentally about democracy. Those 3 oil interests are as follows. The first one, and really the most important, is a vital interest that the United States has in ensuring the free flow of oil at reasonable prices from the Middle East. Over half of the world's oil reserves are located in this region. A 1/5 of the oil that fuels the global economy is transported through the Straits of Hormuz. And the United States has a vital interest in ensuring the free flow of that oil. And it's not just to the United States, where our dependence on Middle Eastern oil has actually been coming down quite dramatically in the last 5 years, to the point that we only import now 10% of our oil from the Gulf, as opposed to China, which imports 60%, India that imports 70%, Europe, I think, is around 50%, Japan, 90%. So the United States actually has less concern about our own oil supplies, but a very real concern about the oil supplies that go to the rest of the global economy, upon which we, of course, depend on for trade. And we have, over the years, provided what is, in effect, a global commons. We have provided this service of protecting the free flow of oil to the world economy, to these other nations that depend upon it. The second interest in oil is related to that, which is to ensure the security and stability of the key oil-producing Arab states. And the most important of those Arab states is Saudi Arabia, not only because it is, or at least was until last week, the largest oil producer in the world. I think Russia just surpassed it. But more importantly, it is the only effective swing producer, that when oil flow is disrupted from other parts of the world for whatever reason, it has the ability to expand its production to make up the difference, and thereby ensure that the price of oil remains in a fairly reasonable price range. The third oil interest relates to ensuring access to the markets of the oil-rich Arab states, especially for American arms sales. And the fourth relates to ensuring the stability of the broader region, which is, as I started off saying, a volatile region, not just this year, but in the last few decades as well, whether it was the Iraq-Iran war or the two wars in Iraq or the 4 Arab-Israeli wars. And so the United States, in order to ensure the free flow of oil at reasonable prices, developed a broader strategy for ensuring the stability of the region itself. And the cornerstone of that broader strategy was Egypt, the largest, militarily most powerful, most influential country in the Arab world, which, as a result of the turn by President Anwar Sadat to the United States in 1972, when he evicted Soviet military advisors, has been, since then, critical cornerstone of America's strategic posture in the Arab world. Now, there is a fifth vital national interest of the United States that derives from these other interests, and that is the interest in settling the Arab-Israeli conflict. Because if we have an interest in ensuring the survival and well-being of Israel and ensuring stability and good relations with these key Arab countries, and the Arabs and Israelis are engaged in conflict, it obviously makes it very difficult to preserve and promote our core interests. And so, since 1967, the end of the Six-Day War, the United States has developed a vital interest derived from those other interests in resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. That effort had one of its first and most important achievements in the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, but it went on from there with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the eviction of Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait in 1991, and the US efforts then to promote the Madrid process for a comprehensive peace between Israel and all of its Arab neighbours and the Palestinians. I don't know how many of you in this room remember those heady days after the first Gulf War, in which Israel and all of its immediate Arab neighbours and the Palestinians, represented in a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, sat down in Madrid together for the first time to launch direct negotiations. That introduced the era of what has become known as Pax Americana, where the United States became the dominant superpower in the world, and in particular the dominant power here in this region, and we sought to use our power to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict as the critical strategy, mechanism for ensuring the protection and promotion of our interests. Along the way, the United States, successive American presidents, had to decide how they would balance this urge for stability in order to protect our interests here and the need to promote our democratic values. The United States, born in a democratic revolution, has since then espoused not just the establishment of a democracy in the United States, but the promotion of democracy abroad. But when it came to the Middle East, successive presidents since the Second World War have chosen to promote stability over the promotion of democracy in this part of the world. It became known as the Arab exception. Essentially, Republican or Democratic presidents alike were willing to make and uphold a pact with any Arab autocratic leader that was willing to maintain stability and stand against those powers in the region, backed through the Cold War by the Soviet Union, who sought to revise the status quo. Whether it was Nasser's Egypt or the Ba'ath in Syria, the Ba'ath in Iraq, we were ready to stand with those Arab powers who would stand against those revisionist powers. And of course, that applied to Iran as well when it went through a revolution. And so, as a result, we had this basic pact in which we said to the leaders of Egypt, the sheikhs of Araby, kings of Jordan, etc., that you support us and work with us to promote stability, and we'll leave you alone to handle your own internal affairs. There was, to be sure, American support for the growth of civil society, women's rights, but when it came to a choice between promoting our values and promoting our interests in the Middle East, in the Arab world, successive presidents decided to promote our interests. There was one exception to this rule. His name was George W. Bush. And he, after toppling Saddam Hussein and failing to find weapons of mass destruction, sought a justification that would rally the support of the American people for the war in Iraq by arguing that this was a war that would promote democracy, not just in Iraq, but through a ripple effect across the region. He advanced what he called the freedom agenda. And his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, famously argued in a speech that she made in Cairo 4 years before Barack Obama, as president, traveled to Cairo to make his speech, in which she said, "For 60 years, my country, the United States, pursued stability at the expense of democracy in this region, here in the Middle East, and we achieved neither. Throughout the Middle East, the fear of free choices can no longer justify the denial of liberty." And that became, for one bright moment, or not so bright moment, the policy of the George W. Bush administration. Bush pressed Mubarak in particular to open some political space in Egypt for moderate secular forces to emerge, and succeeded for a moment in convincing Mubarak to loosen his grip. But when Hamas won the Palestinian elections, and you'll surely all remember that, how Bush insisted, notwithstanding the protest of Abu Mazen and Arik Sharon, about holding democratic elections in the West Bank and Gaza, when Hamas won, Bush relented and returned US policy in the Middle East to its default position. Backed off in particular from pressing Mubarak, who turned around and tightened his grip again. Barack Obama, in his determination to distinguish himself from his predecessor, made clear during his campaign for president that he would not promote democracy in the Middle East, at least not the way that George Bush did. He portrayed himself as a realist in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, Bush 41 tradition, rather than an idealist in the Bush 43 mold. His visionary rhetoric rarely included the word democracy. Many in the Arab world watched his Cairo speech carefully to see how he would handle Mubarak's increased suppression of the opposition after Bush had backed off pressing him to reform. In that speech, that famous Cairo speech, Obama distanced himself from Bush by declaring that no system of government can or should be imposed by one nation on any other. He avowed his support for human rights, but he noted that, quote, "there is no straight line to realise this promise." In his National Security Strategy white paper, which he issued in May 2010, excuse me, the section on promoting democracy and human rights was buried in the back pages. And there he explained his approach of principled engagement with non-democratic regimes. His strategy would be to work with them on counter-terrorism, non-proliferation, economic ties, but also to create what he referred to as permissive conditions for civil society to operate. In other words, there was to be only a quiet, low-key approach to promoting civil society rather than the big D democracy of the Bush, short-lived Bush era. His approach was typically, of him, progressive but pragmatic, working with authoritarian regimes in this region rather than supporting those who would overthrow them. Of course, all that changed 1 year ago, when Mohamed Bouazizi ignited a peaceful democratic protest movement in Tunisia that spawned revolutionary movements across the Arab world. Now the President of the United States faced a very real and difficult dilemma. These Arab people were demanding the very things that we hold dear as Americans. They weren't anti-American, they weren't anti-Israel. They weren't demanding the imposition of Sharia law. They were going out into the streets in peaceful mass demonstrations against their corrupt autocratic leaders who had denied their basic rights for decades and had channeled their anger towards Israel and the United States. How could the United States oppose them? How could we stand with autocratic regimes in the suppression of peaceful mass protests seeking Western-style democracy and accountability of their governments? And so Obama had to find a new balance between interests and values in a very fast-moving situation in which turmoil and revolution were threatening the hold on power of all of our key allies, as well as our adversaries in the region. I want to spend a moment to go through how Obama rebalanced in 4 specific cases, with a particular emphasis on Egypt, because, as I said at the outset, Egypt is the largest, militarily most powerful, culturally most influential Arab country, and the cornerstone of our strategy for maintaining and protecting our interests in the region. In the case of the revolution that took place in Egypt a year ago, it's important to remember that Mubarak already had one foot out of the door. We heard a few minutes ago about how you were already having a session here at the Hebrew University about Egypt after Mubarak. Israeli intelligence was already questioning, and this was appearing in the Israeli press, what would come after Mubarak. That was before the revolutions and before the demonstrations in Tahrir Square quickly grew to the hundreds of thousands. Obama had to make a quick and difficult decision. Should he stick with Mubarak, support him while he suppressed the demonstrations with force, or instead promote an orderly transfer of power to a new, more democratic government? Those were the words that became the objective, the initial objective of the Obama administration, an orderly transfer of power. And that's what he chose. In order to try to achieve that, with all of this turmoil going on in Tahrir Square, Obama sought to preserve the role of the Egyptian military by keeping them out of the fray, hoping that thereby their role could be preserved, not as the backers of the Mubarak regime, but as the midwives of a transition, an orderly transition to democratic government in Egypt. And so he warned the Egyptian military at a critical moment not to fire on the people, and indeed threatened to cut America's substantial military aid, $1.3 billion a year, if they did fire on the people. I don't know how many of you followed the choreography that occurred in those critical days. But after that threat was delivered, the Egyptian military came out and issued their first communique in which they said they would not fire on the people. And that became the invitation for many hundreds of thousands more ended up with millions in the streets, because they understood that the military would not fire on them. That was a critical decision, designed to preserve American interests via the Egyptian military. However, when Mubarak seemed to stall in front of the demands of his people that he go, Obama decided to go one step further and give him a rhetorical push out the door. That's when he said the transition should begin now. And he sent his spokesman out to respond to one of Mubarak's delaying speeches by saying that now means yesterday. That went beyond the idea of trying to secure an orderly transition to the idea of actually getting Mubarak to leave immediately. That, I think, was driven by the president's judgment that he needed to get on the right side of history, that the longer Mubarak stayed, the more difficult it would be to ensure that the military could take control of the situation. And indeed, it was the military that then told Mubarak that he needed to leave. The humiliation of Mubarak by Obama had some rather negative effects on our other friends in the region, including here in Jerusalem. I think the Prime Minister here shared the view with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince of the Emirates, that if this is what the President of the United States would do to a friend and ally of the United States for 30 years, in the face of a few days of demonstrators, what then would he do if the King of Saudi Arabia or the Crown Prince of the Emirates found himself in a similar situation? And so it created a real problem for the President with our friends in the region. But looking back with the benefit of a hindsight of a year, it's important to ask whether he really had any other choice but to insist that Mubarak leave. Certainly his style could have been different. But the bottom line is that to stick with Mubarak would have meant standing by while the army tried to suppress the demonstrators with force. Would that have been a more stable outcome? If Egypt became another Algeria or Syria, would it have been better than preserving the role of the military as the guarantor of stability and as the guarantor of the peace treaty with Israel, as Egypt made what would inevitably be a difficult transition to democracy? I would argue that the President, indeed, made the right choice from the point of view of American interests. But now we face a new choice. Democratic elections have produced a massive victory for the Islamists. And the choice now is whether to work with them or against them. The military clearly is reluctant to give up power. What we see, in effect, is that two things happened at the same time a year ago. There was a revolution that led to the overthrow of the Mubarak regime, and there was a military coup. And the tension between the revolution and the military government is playing itself out in Egypt today. Now there's been a free and fair election, won free and fairly by the Muslim Brotherhood, some 40 to 50%, and by the Salafis, some 25%. What is the United States to do? What Obama has decided is that he will try to work with them. This is signified by two things. The call that he made on the Egyptian military to hand over power to civilian government, to a civilian government that was, quote, inclusive, unquote, which is a code word for including the Islamists. And it will be signified, I think, tomorrow or the next day by the Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, meeting with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood as an indication of first time of a recognition of the Muslim Brotherhood as a hoped-for partner in this process of democratic transition in Egypt. It's a bet, a gamble, that it's possible that the Muslim Brotherhood, as the lead party in the civilian government, understands that it cannot feed 80 million people if it doesn't maintain the stability that will bring foreign tourists and foreign capital back to Egypt. There's one reason above all why this gamble might just turn out to be a safe bet. And it lies in that oil. Egypt is not an oil-rich country. It has no easy way out, like Iran or Saudi Arabia. The Muslim Brotherhood cannot buy off the contradictions, inherent contradictions, between Islamic fundamentalism and modernity with its oil revenues, as Saudi Arabia does. And therefore, if it wants to stay in power, it will have to be pragmatic. Another reason for a likely pragmatism on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood is that for 8 decades it has been in opposition, and that has bred in the Muslim Brotherhood leadership a respect for the Egyptian military. Just at the moment when it has a chance to gain power, it does not want a confrontation with them. And there's another reason. The army doesn't want to lose its assistance from the United States. We have basically, over the last 30 years, paid for, trained, and equipped the Egyptian military. And that military assistance is critical to them. And so they will also act to ensure that the Muslim Brotherhood acts pragmatically. So all of that means that we are unlikely to see a Muslim Brotherhood that seeks to impose Sharia law and seeks to go back to confrontation with Israel and with the United States. That's why their leadership told the New York Times, appears in the Herald Tribune today, that the Muslim Brotherhood will honour the Camp David Accords because this is, quote, a commitment of the state. But Mohammed El-Arian, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, also said, and it's important to hear him, that Israel needed to understand the implications of the Arab revolutions, that they have given new voice to Arab anger at Israel's occupation. So I think what you will see is that they will seek to have good relations with the United States. They will respect the peace treaty with Israel in name. They will hollow it out further in practice, unless, of course, Israel ends its occupation of the West Bank. But as we discussed in the last session, that doesn't seem to be a likely prospect anytime soon. Elsewhere in the Arab world, Obama had to make a different balance between interests and values. In Libya, when the revolution took place there, the United States had very few interests at stake. Essentially, it was a place where we could advance our values without a great deal of concern about our interests. Not much oil comes out of Libya. It was supplied to Europe by European allies. They could find other sources. Saudi Arabia increased its production, and Libya certainly didn't have much impact on our interest in Israel's survival and well-being. So there we could indulge our values to the full extent possible, in particular by advancing and upholding the responsibility to protect civilians against the brutality of Gaddafi's regime. We were happy to let others take the lead. We were happy to support the military intervention when the Arab League called for it and when the UN Security Council endorsed it. In the case of Bahrain, we see the exact opposite calculation. There, the US interests in oil became the dominant and decisive factor. Not because of Bahrain itself, since Bahrain really has no oil, but because of its next-door neighbour, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as I said before, is a critical oil supplier. But beyond our concern about stability in Saudi Arabia was also the concern that Bahrain, a country which had a Sunni king ruling over a majority Shia population, that a revolution there, in which the Sunni king was overthrown, would advantage the Iranian Revolutionary Republic just across the Gulf. And that would have the potential of giving Iran a strategic foothold right next to Saudi Arabia, and able to stir up trouble in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, where Saudi Arabia's minority Shiite population, 10% of the population of Shias, but they're all concentrated in the eastern province next to Bahrain, where most of Saudi Arabia's oil also happens to be concentrated. And so there, when 1/5 of the population of Bahrain came out in the streets to demand change, political change, some of them demanded the overthrow of the king, and Saudi Arabia and the GCC sent in troops to help the king suppress them, the President of the United States said very little other than cautioning for restraint. It was a clear decision to pursue our interests over our values. Finally, is Syria. Here, American interests and American values coincided, and therefore there was no real tension between the two, because in the case of Syria, we had, again, at the beginning, peaceful demonstrations across the country in different places, being brutally suppressed by the Assad regime, which happened to be the strategic ally of our strategic adversary in the region, Iran. The Assad regime is the conduit of Iran's influence into the Arab heartland. And through Damascus, Iran has been able to promote its proxies in Lebanon and Gaza, Hezbollah and Hamas respectively, in their takeover of those areas. right on Israel's borders, giving Iran an ability to stir up the Arab-Israeli conflict that, as I explained to you, lies at the heart, resolving the conflict lies at the heart of protecting and promoting our interests. And here the Iranians had found a way via Syria to challenge our whole strategic concept, and did so quite effectively. And so, if we could, at the same time, support the overthrow of the Assad regime in support of the Syrian people's demand for freedom, and at the same time strike a strategic blow to Iran's efforts to challenge us in the region, we would, in that process, not just reconcile our interests and our values, but also make up for the challenges to our strategic interests we faced in what is happening in Egypt. It's too early to say, to state the obvious, how it will all work out for the United States. At the moment, the pillars of America's strategic position in the Middle East have all become shaky. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, the Israel-Turkey strategic relationship. All of these underpinnings of our strategic posture in the region are now shaky. And at this particular moment, our failure to make progress on Israeli-Palestinian peace has put in question the whole notion of a Pax Americana in the region. Were the Egypt-Israel peace treaty to collapse, the Israel-Jordan peace treaty would soon follow, and that would put paid to the whole effort that the United States has been pursuing since 1967 to protect and promote our interests through making peace. There's one consolation here, in that Iran, our strategic competitor in the region, is actually doing worse than we are. And there's also something important that we should also bear in mind. The Arab people are looking to the West, not to the East. And the Arab leaders are looking to the United States to counter Iran and protect them. We will have to develop, on the run, a new strategic concept for protecting and promoting our interests. But no longer will we have the luxury of promoting only our interests. In very fluid situations, we will have to be committed to transformation in this region, to trying to manage change, shape it towards democracy, while doing our best in the process to preserve our interests in stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for a very candid, enlightening, and penetrating analysis. We still have many questions, I'm sure, and so probably does the audience. We have for another 15 minutes time for your questions, which Ambassador Indyk has agreed to answer, assuming, let's start with you, lady. Please mention your name and your background, if I may.
The answer to the last question is easy. Yes, you are to understand that we were surprised. Not that the Islamists did well, that was expected, but that they did so well, in particular that the Salafis could garner 25% of the vote was a big surprise. It was the first time that even surfaced. Yeah, we're constantly surprised. That's why, by the way, I titled my book Innocent Abroad, in talking about the US engagement in the Middle East. We don't know it very well, and it takes a long time and a lot of humility to know it very well. I might just add as consolation that in my years in Israel, I came to believe that Israelis don't know it very well either. In terms of the question of will it be one vote, one time, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But I would say there are a number of factors, just as I outlined the factors that I think will lead the Muslim Brotherhood to be pragmatic and therefore focus on trying to deliver results for the people. And they understand very well that the people want clean government, but they also want jobs, and they also want economic growth, and they also want decent housing. And they're not demanding Sharia law or a return to war with Israel. So just as I argue that I think they will be pragmatic, I think that there are also other constraints that are likely to make it difficult for them to try to take power through democratic elections and then prevent any democratic elections from being held again. In particular, there are other forces at play. There's a military that will act to constrain them. We don't know yet just how committed the military itself will be to democracy, but they're certainly a player. There is the liberal parties. They have 25% of the vote, and they, together with the youth, know their way back to the square. The Egyptian revolution continues, and I think an attempt to deny the people their democratic rights will be resisted. And I think that the Muslim Brotherhood is smart enough to understand that. As for the red lines, I think from the United States point of view, the red lines are, first of all, that one. That is to say that it cannot be one vote, one time. That democratic processes must be respected, including change of government as a result of democratic elections. Secondly, and I think very importantly from the US point of view, is protection of minority rights, particularly the Coptic minority in Egypt, which is a critical part of democratic life, to protect minority rights, as you know here in Israel. And the third, in the case of Egypt with the Islamists, is protection of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, which, as the Muslim Brotherhood leadership says, is a commitment of the state. Now, the second part of your question was, what does that mean? If the United States is prepared to engage with the Muslim Brotherhood, what does that mean in the future for Hamas? And there I think that, I don't speak for the US government, but I think that the concern in the case of Hamas will relate to its attitude towards violence and terrorism as a way of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and its attitude towards the peace agreements that have been struck with the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords. So there's a difference between honouring an election and being willing to engage with an elected party a party that's won an election, but nevertheless pursues policies that are fundamentally against America's interests. And so it will depend on how Hamas deals with those two other issues. But I think implicit in your question is a point that's well taken. There is inevitably an implication in the US engagement with Muslim Brotherhood, a much greater willingness than was ever evinced before of the United States to engage with Islamic political parties. Now, as for the question of Israeli policy, first of all, if you'll allow me to say, I wouldn't accept the definition of American policy as going with the flow, because I don't think that is an accurate characterization. It's much more this question of balancing where our interests take precedence, so we'll reduce our focus on promoting our values. Where we can balance our values and interests in new ways, I think we will do so. For Israel, I think, like in the case of the United States, it's important to accept, I know this is very hard for Israelis to accept, that it's not about you, just like it's not about us. That these revolutions were not about the government's policies towards Israel, these autocratic leaders' policies towards Israel. Indeed, I think there was popular resentment of the way in which these authoritarian regimes had deflected the demands of their people into conflict with Israel, or anti-Israeli attitudes, or anti-American attitudes. And so if it's not about Israel, it's important that Israel not make it about Israel. And there, I think it's very important that while the Arab world is distracted from the Palestinian issue, while the Palestinian issue has been downgraded dramatically for most of the Arab world in importance, while the Palestinian leadership that wants to make peace with Israel, that is Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad, find themselves now in a real quandary as to how they can advance their interests, and are looking for a way back to the table, as evidenced by their willingness to engage with Israel in Jordan, that this would be a very good time to try to find a way to deal with their requirements. Because one way or another, the Palestinian issue will come back on the agenda of these Arab countries. And one can imagine a scenario where things blow up with the Palestinians, that and Israel is required to use force, that a popularly elected Egyptian parliament will introduce a legislation to abrogate the peace treaty in an emotional moment where popularly elected politicians feel that they need to respond to Israeli use of military force against Palestinians, and suddenly you get a situation which is not under the control of anybody. And that's something which I think Israel and the United States have a vital strategic interest in avoiding. But you can't avoid it unless you find a way to move forward with the Palestinians. And so that's why I think the wisest Israeli policy in these circumstances is to take advantage of the fact that it's not about you, to try to resolve a problem that is in your own interest to resolve anyway, with the people that want to resolve it on the Palestinian side. That is Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad. I know it's very popular conventional wisdom here to say we don't have a partner. I think that's a conventional wisdom that needs to be challenged, and that Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad have demonstrated time and again their commitment to peace with Israel, and they should be taken up on that commitment rather than ignored for the sake of a status quo that looks very stable today but could become very tenuous very quickly. Do we have another hour?
Have another 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Thank you. They're all very good questions. The decision by President Obama to sign into law the latest sanctions, the sanctions on Iran's central bank, or more exactly on banks that do business with Iran's central bank, moves the United States in the direction of the regime change that you asked about. And that's, I think, why you see the Iranian regime responding with its threats to shipping going through the Straits of Hormuz, decision to call for the execution of the supposed American spy, the announcement that they're moving ahead with 20% enrichment in Fordo. I think all of that is a result of the Iranian regime itself feeling that now its survival could be threatened. Because these sanctions have the potential, we'll see how they play themselves out, but they have the potential, together with the ban on oil imports by the Europeans, to seriously restrict the flow of revenues to the Iranian government from its sale of oil. And the Chinese have also cut their imports of Iranian oil by 50% now, and may cut it further. So we're moving into the arena that you referred to. The chances of the United States using military force to achieve regime change are, for the time being at least, zero. The United States has been involved in two very difficult wars in the greater Middle East over the last 10 years. The President of the United States is committed to ending those wars in the Middle East. One of the platforms on which he will run for re-election is the fact that he's ending the wars in the Middle East. Now, if the Iranians do something to provoke us, it's a different story. But in the service of regime change, I do not believe that the United States is going to invade Iran. I simply see that as zero chance that that is going to happen. But the way things play themselves out is very uncertain. Will the Iranian supreme leader decide that with his back to the wall, he should not make Gaddafi's mistake and agree to negotiate to give up his nuclear capabilities, but rather go for broke and achieve a nuclear weapons capability and basically achieve the protection that North Korea has achieved by having nuclear weapons. The President of the United States has said very clearly that he will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. So we're moving into a very complicated and I would say dangerous phase in the confrontation between, I shouldn't say confrontation, but the effort by the United States to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions. And all I would say is just be careful what you wish for. There was a question about how the United States should respond to the abrogation of the peace treaty with Egypt, Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. I think that we're making very clear, not loudly, but to all the parties involved in Egyptian politics, that that is a red line for the United States. It's not the only red line, but it is a very important one. And the most immediate response will be, I would say, an automatic cutoff of the military assistance and the economic assistance and the other efforts to help the Egyptian people get back on their feet after the revolution. So I think it would be a very problematic move from the US point of view. I'm glad that you raised the question of the Turkish model because it gives me a chance to expound on one element of a new American strategy for the region. Clearly, our own ability to influence events has been reduced. And when we look around the region to see who we can work with, Turkey becomes a very important ally in the effort. Turkey, of course, is an ally of the United States, a NATO ally of the United States. But in this new revolutionary period in the Arab world, the fact that Turkey is an Islamic democracy, its government is Islamic, but it is very much a democratically elected government. It's won 3 free and fair elections. And the Prime Minister espouses a secularism in the political realm, and he did so in Cairo. That is precisely the kind of message that the United States wants to reinforce in terms of the way, in particular, that the Egyptian revolution proceeds. But beyond that, we have a strategic convergence with Turkey when it comes to dealing with the challenge of Syria. Turkey, of course, is Syria's northern neighbor. Turkey, of course, has a very capable military. Turkey, like the United States, has broken with the Assad regime. Turkey had a much closer relationship with the Assad regime than the United States did. And the Turkish foreign minister has spoken recently about the need perhaps to establish safe havens. He called them corridors, but essentially what we're talking about is safe havens inside Syria that would be presumably protected by the Turkish military. And of course, Turkey is now providing safe haven in Turkey and a political platform in Turkey for the Syrian opposition, including the Free Syrian Army, which is based in Turkish Syrian refugee camp inside Turkey. So as I argued that we have a strategic interest in seeing the overthrow of the Syrian regime, Turkey is a country that we can work with to try to achieve that objective. The United States is not about to intervene militarily in Syria, partly for the reasons that I've already explained about our limited appetite for the use of force in the Middle East today, but partly because the circumstances are much more complicated in Syria. If Turkey has the will to intervene, I'm quite convinced that the United States will support it in doing so. There is one other element to a broad reorientation of America's strategy, which is, excuse me, a strong interest in seeing the rehabilitation of the Turkish-Israeli strategic relationship. Because as we look for solid pillars upon which we can depend on in this period of tumult, Israel, Turkey are two of our allies. The fact that they are at loggerheads is not in our interests. And that is why the United States has worked hard to try to promote a resolution of the tensions between Turkey and Israel. And why we are urging both sides to swallow their pride and find a way to put these issues behind them for the sake of a broader common interest in promoting stable democratic change in the region, which should be a common interest of the United States, Turkey, and the Israeli democracy. Russia as a strategic competitor. No, we don't see Russia as a strategic competitor in the region. It, in some cases, is a nuisance. So, for example, in Syria, where it is blocking UN Security Council action. But I don't think that's going to be long-lived. The Russians find themselves in a rather awkward position, trying to defend what they imagine to be some strategic interest in Syria, while the Arab world turns against them for doing so. And the Arab League's move to isolate Syria, suspend it, sanction it, along with Turkey's move, really leaves Russia a choice of to be isolated with the Assad regime or to get on the right side of history. And I think it's only a matter of time before they will do so. Otherwise, the Russians have little to offer the Arabs. And so, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they basically have not been a major player. Certainly, they don't confront us and compete with us and try to undermine us in the way that the Iranians do. And in the case of Iran, we have been working quite effectively. President Obama and the leadership in Russia have been working quite effectively to sanction Iran, to prevent Iran from acquiring weapons from Russia, and there we're much more strategic partners than competitors, and that is the case in Afghanistan as well. Very good question about the Shia in Bahrain versus the Shia in Iraq. I agree with you that we should not be making such distinctions. There is, however, a real interest, as I outlined, in preventing instability in Bahrain from creating a major problem for the free flow of oil at reasonable prices from that part of the world. But I think that we should be far more vocal in pressing the King of Bahrain to engage in a serious effort to accommodate the reasonable political demands of the Shia opposition and find a way to move forward towards opening the political system there in a way that gives the people their democratic rights. As a general principle that follows from a new American approach to the region, which is seeking to promote democratic transformations, the United States needs to convince the sheikhs and monarchs of the Arab world that they should get on the road towards constitutional monarchies. The King of Morocco is already heading down that road. The King of Jordan is talking about doing so. But the King of Saudi Arabia is opposed to that. And we need to have a new understanding with our Saudi ally about the need for meaningful political reform in the monarchies of the Arab world if we are to find a way to establish a more reasonable balance between our interests and our values in those countries that are our allies. Finally, what took so long to move against the Assad regime? This is a long story. I'll promote my next book, which is about to come out, which looks in detail at what we've been talking about tonight and describes it in detail. But I would say, essentially, that two things held us up. One was, ironically, that in the case of Libya, the president had demanded that Gaddafi step down, leave Libya early on, but was unwilling to take the lead, and I think correctly because our interests didn't require it, in getting rid of him. And there was a gap that opened up between the president's rhetoric and what he was prepared to do about it. In the end, it worked out okay. 6 months later, Gaddafi was gone. But during that time, the president came under considerable criticism for talking a good game but not being willing to act on it, other than to lead from behind, is the way that it was described by one of his advisors. So when it came next to dealing with Syria, the White House was extremely reluctant to get out in front when a decision had been made that we would not intervene militarily. And so the big question was, you know, if we call for his overthrow, how are we going to achieve it? So there was a reluctance to call for the overthrow. There was no reluctance to sanction the regime, to generate as much support as possible for regime change there. But the rhetoric was slow to catch up with that overall effort for the reason that I explained. Again, 6 months later, we did end up calling for Assad to leave power. And we have, you know, you described us as doing nothing. I think that is highly inaccurate. The United States has been leading the effort to isolate the Syrian regime, to sanction it, in particular to get the Europeans to stop their oil imports from Syria. And the Syrian economy is now reeling. And that is critically important because, it's only a matter of time before the Sunni elites decide to break with the Assad regime, and that will be critically important in terms of Assad's demise. There was a second factor that held us up and continues to be a source of concern, which is what will happen to the Christian minority in Syria. And the Christians, for the time being, are aligned with the regime. And we are working very hard with the Syrian opposition to try, on the one hand, to unify them, to get them to provide a coherent alternative to Assad, but at the same time for them to reach out to the Christians and to the Alawite community and make it clear to them that Assad is wrong. They will not face slaughter if Assad goes and if they break with him. We're dealing with a very complicated situation there. I would have liked to see, precisely because, as I said, our interests and values were aligned there, I would have liked to see the president be more forceful earlier on. But I have no complaints about the policy that he is now pursuing, because I think it's the correct one. And I think it's a matter of staying the course. Unfortunately, in the process, because the regime is so brutal and so determined to kill or be killed, that a lot of Syrians are going to die in the process, but I have no doubt that in the end, the regime will be overthrown. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Indyk, for your penetrating and interesting, excellent analysis. I also thank you, the audience, for staying in this chilly room and listening to Ambassador Indyk. Thank you.